And welcome back to the Clinical Athlete Podcast. This is episode 2. My name is Quinn Henoch. I'm a doctor of physical therapy in Orange County, California. And I'm joined by Michael Ray, a doctor of chiropractic in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Mike, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm good, man. That was an awkward wave. It's like pretending that we haven't been sitting on here for half an hour arguing.
Is that better?
Yeah. We're also joined by Derek Miles, a doctor of physical therapy, currently in Gainesville, Florida, but soon to be in the San Francisco Bay Area. Or is that still on the hush hush?
Oh no, it's public knowledge.
Oh, okay, awesome. How are you?
Well, how about yourself?
Good, man. Excited to jump on another show. We made it to episode 2. We've survived episode 1 storm. Speaking of which, a couple announcements. We are officially on iTunes. So if you go onto the Apple Podcast app and just search Clinical Athlete, you can subscribe to the podcast. You can leave a review, preferably nice ones. But you know, we appreciate the honesty, but don't be mean about it. Don't be a jackass. 5 stars or else, or nothing. 5 stars or nothing. And we're also on YouTube, Clinical Athlete YouTube channel, and several other platforms, including SoundCloud and your RSS feed. So if you just go on clinicalathlete.com and just click on the podcast icon on the home page, it's a list of all the platforms that we're on. And we have a bunch of upcoming events. Our Clinical Athlete continuing education curriculum is popping right now. Several 2-day Clinical Athlete weightlifting certification courses. I'll announce those first, and then the Scientific Principles of Sports Rehab. So the CWC course is coming to Bremerton, Washington in July, Dallas, Texas in September, Brooklyn, New York in September, Sherwood, Oregon, which is close to Portland, in November, and La Crosse, Wisconsin in November. That'll be fun. That'll be nice and cold. And then the Scientific Principles of Sports Rehab course, which Derek and Michael, what's your name? And Mike give our lecture to. Our first one is actually coming up in Boston in a week. Are you guys excited?
Extremely. Can't wait to get up in the Northeast for the weekend.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm super excited. So the very first SPOSR course is happening in 1 week. Hopefully this podcast is out in time. And that's in Worcester, Massachusetts on July 8th. You guys are also going to Harrisonburg, Virginia, Mike's hometown, or at least where you live now, in July 29th. Hillsboro, Oregon, August 19th. Ottawa, that's Canada, September 16th. Falls Church, Virginia, September 23rd. Richmond, Virginia, the next day, September 24th. Harwood Heights, Illinois, on September 30th to October 1st. That's a special 2-day course. You guys will have a lab portion there on day 2, so that'll be awesome. And then we just got a new one set up for Seattle on November 18th. So guys, check out those dates, all the registration. We have early bird rates, and all the details of the course are on clinicalathlete.com. So let's get on with today's podcast. We are going to discuss a recent article titled "The Effects of Tissue Flossing on Ankle Range of Motion and Jump Performance." This was out of the Journal of Physical Therapy in Sport. It was accepted in December 2016, and it was published early 2017. The authors on this study are Matthew Driller and Ryan Overmare. The objective, or the stated objective of the study, was to evaluate the effect of band flossing. And I'll just reiterate kind of or detail that if people are like, what the hell is band flossing? It's the common practice now, it seems, of taking rubber compression bands and just wrapping them tightly around the joint, and then maybe either just hanging out or moving through a certain range of motion. So the objective was to evaluate the effect of band flossing on ankle range of motion and jump performance. This was a crossover study design. So essentially, I'm going to roll through the procedures here. So essentially, they had 52 healthy recreational athletes, 29 males, 23 females. They were roughly college age, anywhere from like 20 years plus or minus 4 years. So, relatively young, healthy. What they did was they tested 4 things. Pre-tested, the participants nor the assessors or testers were blinded. They looked at ankle dorsiflexion with what's called the weight-bearing lunge test, which is you're in half kneeling and you shift your knee to the wall and then you scoot your foot back and you shift your knee to the wall. They're looking for like the distance between your foot and the wall to measure anterior tibial translation. They also measured dorsiflexion with a goniometer and plantar flexion with a goniometer in long sitting, I think, with the knee extended. They looked at jump height using some type of force plate. Correct me if I'm wrong there, guys. I wasn't familiar with the device, but gym-aware device is what they used to measure jump height and jump velocity. They used a transducer for those things. So they tested those 4 measures, and then they wrapped one of the ankles of the participants with the compression bands. The other ankle was the control. What is that sound in the background? What is that? Somebody doing some shit?
Someone beating on a wall.
You guys hear that?
Yeah, someone was beating on a wall somewhere.
Is that on my end?
No, I think it's on mine. My wife's upstairs baking.
What is she pounding on something? All right.
She's making macaroons. Yeah.
Oh, sweet.
Taking out her aggression towards Mike on some history.
We're keeping this in, by the way.
That's fine.
Okay. So they wrapped the one ankle around. It didn't really specify whether they wrapped like what am I going here? My dominant hand. Oh, dominant leg. Jesus. Or the right or left. It was just wrapped the leg. The other leg was the control. So on the same participant, one was wrapped, the other was not. And they had them go through full range ankle plantar flexion and ankle dorsiflexion for 2 minutes to their comfortable range on both ankles. So they're sitting there, and one ankle's got the band, and it's pumping through plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. The other ankle does not, and it's doing the same thing. And they did that for 2 minutes, and then they retested after a minute. So they took the band off, and they let them walk around, basically just like walk it off. You know, if their foot was like asleep or they couldn't feel their toes, that type of thing. And then they retested, and what did they find? Mike, what did they find?
They claim to have found a slight increase in range of motion. Specifically, I think their focus was mostly on dorsiflexion improvement. And then also they found improved slightly jump height, jump velocity, and a couple of centimeters, not even a couple, 1.6 centimeter difference between groups for weight-bearing lunge test.
I can already hear your bias coming out. All right, I'm going to go into table 1, the results. So yes, that's what they found. They actually found increases, or at least trends toward significance in all of them. The weight-bearing lunge test, they found a small but significant effect in the amount of anterior tibial translation. I think the total difference between groups is 1.8 centimeters, but the control group also improved by 0.2 centimeters. So the actual difference was a 1.6 centimeter increase in anterior tibial translation with the weight-bearing lunge test. Plantar flexion improved in both groups. It was not statistically significant, although it was a small effect. Dorsiflexion measured with the goniometer in the open chain improved, or did it? In the floss, it actually went down. If you look at that.
No,
it went down. Yeah, you're right. That's right. Yeah. We talked about that. It's super weird. Okay, so yeah, they improved by 7 degrees. And the control group improved by 1 degree, so pre and post, and that was a small but significant effect size. Jump height, there was no significant difference between groups because both groups improved pretty much the same. They all put roughly like 3/4 of an inch on their single leg jump height. And I didn't specify this, but it was a single leg jump. It wasn't a double leg jump. And then jump velocity was shown to have a significant improvement, floss group versus the control group, improving by 0.15 seconds, it looks like. So the burst that you've got going up. So they found effects. Now, before we get into the narratives and the discussion of these results, what were some strengths? First of all, why are they doing this study, Mike? Why are they even asking this question? What's the relevance here?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a couple of good premise or a couple of good ideas that they're trying to look at here. mainly to see what's the effect of improving range of motion acutely on performance. They also wanted to see is there a possibility looking at with this improved range of motion and jump performance and velocity improvement, can they mitigate risk of injury with it? So they wanted to see, this is a kind of a low-tech implement. It does cost a little bit of money to order and utilize, but that an athlete could do on their own pre-exercise or pre-competition. So they wanted to see what are the effects of it, if any, and if it really matters or not in order to do this implement.
Derek, what are your thoughts on the reasoning behind asking the questions that they're asking? Why are they doing this study?
Well, I think studies like this are good starting points because there is a plethora of interventions that have permeated the rehab world that don't have any evidence beyond anecdote. And the authors here are trying to at least contribute to the body of knowledge on it. So, with the rate with which these interventions are being a part of and integrated into the rehab setting, we certainly need to have some justification for why we're going to use them or not use them. And I think the authors here wanted to take a good initial step towards seeing if there's any applicability to it.
Yeah, just to echo what you guys said, they kind of summarize that nicely in the first paragraph of the intro. The anecdotal use of floss bands amongst athletes is becoming a popular strategy and they say to increase range of motion, enhance prevention or rehab from an injury, or even improve athletic performance, despite limited evidence for its efficacy. So that translates to me as it's very popular. There's all these narratives being thrown around, but there's not that much evidence. So let's look at this. And obviously we appreciate that for all the reasons that you guys said. Now let's talk about some strengths. Mike, what'd you like about the study?
I thought they did well with the execution of it. For overall, they did proper separation or randomization into two groups. I would have liked to have seen maybe that they had an actual control group instead of just seeing one leg versus the other, but it worked for them. They executed it well. They repeated the measures accordingly to how they were implemented from baseline to post-intervention. So, overall, they even actually measured millimeters of mercury as far as the pressure that the bands were exerting onto the tissue, which I thought was really cool, especially they were trying to run a parallel to BFR. And I'm sure we'll get into that later about the differences between this and blood flow restriction equipment. But yeah, I thought they tried to account for as many variables as they could think of.
Yeah. Derek, what'd you like about it?
Well, I think it's a good gateway study into looking at this topic. The fact that they actually looked at range of motion in both goniometric measurement and in more, I guess we would say, functional measurements such as a weight-bearing lunge test, it gives some different angles with which to look and see what's going on.
Yeah, I think so too. On that point, Derek, we'll probably talk about some of these studies forward, the ones that they cited, but I've seen some difference, like some studies looking at ankle range of motion and then different performance markers, and they see differences in whether the knee is locked versus whether the knee is bent. So like the weight-bearing lunge versus the locked knee. So in one study, it showed a change in like the weight-bearing lunge test had some association with altered squat mechanics, but not for jumping, whereas measuring the ankle with the knee extended had more of an association with landing mechanics. So maybe it does have some type of proximity to the weight-bearing lunge mimics more of how the ankle will occur in the squat or how it'll move in the squat, something like that. So I agree with you. I liked, as you said, Michael, I thought it was cool that they measured the pressure because that's obviously a variable that's probably, as this thing is used, in clinic and just in the gym, that's one variable that's not controlled for. People they're going either pulling it as tight as they possibly can, or it's like super loose and it's just there because it's doing something because they think it's doing something. So I like that a lot. I think that was cool. And the gym aware, as I'm looking at their jump height and jump velocity, I guess this is a nice, has shown to be a valid means of measuring those two outcomes. So I thought that was good. And I think they laid out their procedures well enough that I could repeat this study. So that's always something that you're looking at, Does it make sense? Could I do this thing? And I think they laid that out relatively well. What else? Strengths, just general strengths pop out at you. Anything?
Well, part of it is, it isn't an expansive study, so
yeah.
there's not a whole lot that we can really hash out of it.
True.
I agree with you. We could certainly or should be able to come close to simulating or repeating the experiment off of the methods they gave us. So I think it's good that those are clear.
Mike, you
Yeah,
got
I
anything
agree
else?
with that.
Okay.
No, I agree with that. It's definitely reproducible based on how they outlined everything. If we wanted to get together and collect some athletes and go test this out, we definitely could do it.
Now, okay, well, let's just get into the weaknesses. I can tell that Mike's just chomping on the bit here. Finally.
I'm trying to control myself.
I know, man. Okay. Before I forget, I want to touch on the blinding aspect of this because I think it's a big deal. Neither the participants nor the assessors were blinded, meaning everybody a part of the study knew which ankle was the treatment group. They knew which ankle was the control group. That's a potential source of bias, and that's why it's nice to blind studies, and that way nobody is swayed or influenced one way or another. Now, we're all going to kind of probably agree, and also I want to preface this by saying that they mentioned this as a limitation in their study, so they are not blind to the fact that this is a limitation of the study. So they disclose that, and I think we'd all agree that it's probably very difficult to blind the participants. But I would reference a study that actually Jill Cook was in recently or a part of, where they actually did blind the participants. They told it was blood flow restriction training. So they blinded the assessors, which we'll talk about probably at least in this study they should have done. But they blinded the participants by telling them that all of them were going to get BFR, blood flow restriction training, but they gave them a sham cuff. It just wasn't the same cuff. It wasn't producing the occlusion. It was just enough for them to feel. And then I'm assuming that the participants weren't familiar enough with BFR to know the difference. So they just know that they're getting something, and they don't know if it's the treatment or not. Could they have done something like this here, Derek?
Well, since they were measuring for millimeters of mercury, they certainly could have blinded the participants by having one ankle not put as much tension on. I agree with you. The more blatant confounder would be the assessor side of it. And, all of us as clinicians have all measured a joint and been like, oh, we can get an extra 5 degrees out of this, or if we need to, or we get the patients that are like, oh yeah, I can bend my knee a little farther than that. So if you know what's going on, you're already the principle will be clinical equipoise and how much you believe what you're doing is going to work. So blinding the assessors here would have been a very key thing to strengthen their study.
Mike, what do you think? Do you think they should have, at least at minimum, blinded the assessors, but also could have blinded the participants?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely I agree with what Derek said. Absolutely blind the assessors. It just turns into a confirmation bias. Like they're already expecting to find something because that's the hypothesis they're testing. And so you just kind of look for that to improve range of motion because you did it. So you're kind of confirming what you're hoping to find. Not saying that does happen, but there is a risk for that. And so then it can kind of muddy the waters with your data that you've picked up from the study. I'm not sure I'm blinding the participants. I think the example you gave with the BFR study with Jill Cook was a good representation. I just don't know, because that's just a cuff you slide on the arm, and then you can pretend to pump it up, and you don't do anything with it. And as long as they're naive to what it is, it's much easier to do it with BFR, I would think, versus I've got to wrap this rubber tubing basically around you, and you've got to wrap it tight enough to at least where it stays. So I don't know. You could try it. I'm just not sure how well it would work out.
Well, a point on that is you can, because the fear is then that the participants know what group they're in, just inherently, but
right.
you can survey them afterwards, and that can be part of like something that you put in there is that we surveyed the participants afterwards and asked them what group they thought they were in.
Sure.
If you get some kind of mix, I've seen some studies do that as well to just kind of validate the fact of the participants that the blinding did its job. Yeah, I agree with you. At minimum, we're blinding the assessors to try to decrease that bias. Now, so there's a lot to unpack here. Let's just look at the results. I think that should be where we start, because we can look at the numbers here on table 1, and the effect sizes are all small. This is also a point that they emphasize. They do not say in the discussion or anywhere in the results that we had large effect sizes. These the numbers are jumping at us, that there are huge differences between groups, because that wasn't the case. They're all small effect sizes. Some are trending towards trivial. They're all but one in the 0.2 range. So like the low end of the small effect size. So let's just be realistic about what happened here. The weight-bearing lunge test, again, there was a 1.6 difference, 1.6 centimeter difference between groups when they took the band off and they retested the weight-bearing lunge test. But Mike, you've done some digging on standard error of measurement and clinically, minimum clinically significant difference for the weight-bearing lunge test. Talk to me about that. Those numbers, like, does a 1.6 centimeter difference jump out at you as something that matters?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question we need to focus on with this study. I'll probably start with who they referenced. They referenced Bunnell as the validation for why to use the weight-bearing lunge test. And the interesting thing with Bunnell is he basically says to account for standard error of measurement that you would probably need to see at least 1 centimeter or approximately 3 degrees increase in order to say that wasn't just simply the error of measurement from pre-trial to post-trial. To actually read for him, he says, for example, if a therapist was using a mobilizing technique to improve range of motion of ankle dorsiflexion, a change of greater than approximately 1 centimeter or 3 degrees would be required to confidently attribute the observed change to the technique rather than to the measurement error of itself. So if we're talking between group differences of 1.6 centimeters, once we account for the standard error of measurement, you're now looking at 0.6 centimeters. We also need to take into account minimal detectable change. So is there a big enough change between measurements between pre-intervention and post-intervention to actually be quantifiable, which we could also call that into question as well. There are several studies that kind of looked at that with the weight-bearing lunge test.
And we're not and that's not the same as an MCID, a minimally clinically important difference. Just to see change,
right.
and then you have to jump at a tier to say, is that even clinically relevant?
We don't even have those, as to my knowledge. They totally could be out there. I just haven't seen them, but I'm not sure what would be clinically meaningful. Like just because you increased it by, let's say, if we account for SEM, 0.6 centimeters, what does that translate to dynamically in sport, since they're focusing on jump height and jump velocity? Does that really make a difference in their ability to access that range of motion? That's tough to say. And then the other side of that coin is, obviously, as clinicians, we're dealing with pain. So does a 0.6 centimeters increase in weight-bearing lunge test for tibial translation mean you have 1 decremental point decrease in pain scale? I mean, it doesn't. There's no translation there that I'm aware of.
Derek, what about you? Or is that 1.6 centimeter difference giving you chills?
Well, I think this is a good point of discussion regarding just some of the vernacular used in discussing articles versus what we implement in our actual practice, and it's the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. So these values did reach statistical significance, which, depending on how you're going to, and it would have been nice if the authors would have given us the p-values in table 1 for what their differences were. But statistical significance just means there's a low likelihood of the difference that you're seeing being according to chance, whereas clinical significance is, does whatever this difference is have any applicability to what we do in practice? But for us, a lot of times, especially when you first start reading the literature, significance has this major connotation associated with it, to where when we hear it, we're like, ooh, this has to be different. This is great. And, they did reach statistical significance, but a very small difference in between groups here. And 1.6 centimeters isn't, it's, when you look at the standard deviation associated with it, it's very unimpressive. And if you want a good visual way of looking at this, you can always get some graph paper out and basically just draw those lines with the confidence interval. And yes, you're going to see your means are different, but with the amount of overlap between those groups, it kind of washes away pretty fast.
Yeah, it almost becomes like, okay, did they measure error? And what they did measure, like, it's just breaching significance. Like, they themselves set the significance at 0.2 for judging effect size. And if you look through those, and I think you already mentioned this, Quinn, most of them just barely breached 0.2 for significance.
Yeah, and Derek mentioned the standard deviation. So with the weight-bearing lunge test specifically, in the floss group, the pre-testing measure was, the average was 10.9 centimeters with a standard deviation of 6. So you've got, standard deviation that's more than half of the average. And then the post-test, so you went from 10.9, did the treatment, and then you went to 12.7 with a standard deviation of 6.5. So it spans, 50% of the average. There's just a lot of variance there, and it's just with the small effect, it's very, very hard to say if our question is that difference is enough for me to begin to implement this into my practice. I'm gonna make that decision and begin to spend the time here and educate the athlete. That's always what we have to come back to, right? Are these whether they did statistics, do they did the statistics well? That's one thing. And then what are the outcomes? Are they enough to make me change my practice? That's what we have to be asking. It's tough with that. It really is. Mike, you mentioned the Spinal study and that's from '98. That's a reliability study for weight-bearing lunge tests. And to my knowledge, that's the first one that was done. There's been several after that. There's a reliability and validity of a weight-bearing measure of ankle dorsiflexion range of motion by Chisholm in 2012. Reliability of 3 measures of ankle dorsiflexion range of motion by Connor in 2012. The intra and inter-rater reliability of a modified weight-bearing lunge measure of ankle dorsiflexion by Graft in 2013. All of these studies showed repeatability with this test. So that's a strength of the study, is they used the weight-bearing lunge test. It used a reliable tool.
Sure.
It's repeatable at least. It goes back to what I'm sure that we'll talk about is why does that matter, and the validity as it relates to the narratives that they're spinning here in the conclusions, which is injury prevention and performance enhancement. And so that's kind of where what we have to dive into. Let's move on to each measure. So the weight-bearing lunge test, that's what we're looking at as far as the results is a little bit closer. So we have to always take into account the standard deviations there. When we look at ankle plantar flexion, that was not statistically significant, and I don't know where that would be relevant either. I understand why they did it, to just see global change in ankle range of motion, but we'll jump to dorsiflexion, open chain dorsiflexion measured with a goniometer, where the floss group improved by 7 degrees, plus or minus 13 degrees as a standard deviation. And then the control group increased by 1 degree. Derek, does a 7 degree, so if we're imagining a goniometer, does a 7 degree increase in range of motion after 2 minutes of work, what does that mean to you?
Well, the authors say in the end, they doing this 5 minutes later, they don't know how long the effect is going to be, so it doesn't make a huge difference out of that. 7 degrees, if you look at it, that's a decent little bit of dorsiflexion, but in the same token, going back to what I said a minute ago, I can push a little harder if I really believe a treatment works, and all of a sudden I start getting into some more. And this isn't a fault of the author. We're all just as guilty of this. Anyone who's been listening to us talk for 25 minutes, it's pretty clear where our biases are. So this is part of the reason, to come back to it one more time, why blinding is so necessary for this. Because our biases are going to show through. And if we want to see if what we're doing is really working, then we need to account for those biases, both whether it be pro the intervention or anti the intervention.
Yeah. I also think, too, we have to call into question, why would I use this implement over other things like static stretching or foam rolling or PNF or anything else that you can think of? Why would I pick banded flossing pre-exercise for 7 degrees of dorsiflexion? Because I'm pretty positive I could look through the literature and find all of those implements I just named off also showing a transient increase in ranges of motion.
Well, and maybe that's, and I think maybe that's potentially why this paper is helpful, to tell me that perhaps this intervention is no better than anything else that you can do to get the same, you know what I mean? So when you look at it, well, this data is not sufficient for me to choose this intervention. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe that's just one more thing that you can kind of trim off the plate. But I agree with you, and I agree with you, Derek. I think this is where blinding comes into play. And You can't discount that. When you're talking about 7 degrees on a goniometer versus versus 1 degree, so truly a 6-degree difference between groups, I can shove somebody's ankle 6 degrees further. You know what I mean? And also, the standard error of measurement, from what I've seen in most goniometry studies, is at least 3 degrees.
Yeah, it only hangs around 3 to 5.
Yeah, so we're looking at that too. So that's potentially cutting the difference in half again. Now we're looking at maybe 3 to 4 degrees difference max. So very similar to the weight-bearing lunge test. There is it's statistically significant. How much does it matter? That's up for debate here. Jump height was interesting because both groups improved pretty much the same amount. We went from the pre-floss group, 0.23 meters to 0.27, and I think that equated to about a 3/4 inch difference in single leg jump height. And that was a similar 0.24 to 0.26 change in the control group. And how much of that is just they repeated the test and they kind of get a better idea of how to go, how to push on either leg?
Yeah, I think that's a big point to make too. Like all of this was done in the same session on the same day. So they did they did baseline measurements, then they did either control intervention or they did flossing intervention, and then they redid all the baseline measurements again in the same session in a matter of minutes. So we definitely have to take into account there was probably a learning effect that occurred from baseline measurements to post-intervention measurements, like without a doubt.
Jump velocity improved, and with a small effect of 0.22 with a standard deviation of 0.14. So again, if you take into account the standard deviation, then the effect size has not reached the threshold of being an effect, being a small effect. At that point, it's considered trivial if you take into account the standard deviation. But regardless, jump velocity improved in the floss group from 1.88 meters per second to 2.03. So you get a 0.15 second change there, or meters per second. And then with the control group, they improved to 1.94 to 1.97. It just wasn't as much. But standard deviations in the floss group, we've got the 2.03 as their post measure. The standard deviation was 0.37 meters per second. So a good chunk, a good chunk of their of the difference there, or twice the difference, was their standard deviation. So it's just hard. And how much does 0.15 change in jump velocity equate to improved performance? I don't know.
Well, if it didn't change jump height, then likely not very much, because your actual metric should be how high you're jumping if we're going to talk performance.
Right. Wouldn't you? If you're producing more force, you're probably going to go faster, and higher and higher.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And also, let's not forget the participants were recreational athletes. And honestly, looking at these numbers, I don't think they were trained. I don't think they were highly trained, or at least had big backgrounds. They didn't seem to be putting up huge numbers. So with that type of population, you're probably going to get an effect from a lot of things.
I think the inclusion criteria was just recreational athletes who exercise 3 times a week.
Yeah. So
with no pre-existing lower extremity injuries.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a point too where it's very, very important to read the full study, and you honestly don't have to be a whiz at statistics to see that some of this stuff is a little bit kind of like, you're looking at the conclusions, or you're looking at the fact that things were statistically significant, but when you actually look at the numbers, you've got to question the clinical relevance. And I'm actually going to jump down, before we get into start talking about these things a little bit more, to jump down to the conclusion, because this was where I took a bit of pause. In the conclusion, paragraph 5 on here on page 4, I'm quoting the article: the potential benefits regarding the results of this study, the results that all three of us just debated or discussed, the potential results of these studies, this study may have a significant impact in the sports setting. More specifically, our results would suggest that including band flossing on the ankle joint before taking part in any sports that require jumping actions may not only improve performance, but may also provide a novel strategy for injury prevention through increasing ankle range of motion. So they're taking the results that we just discussed as being called into question based on their clinical significance, but they're taking that into the narrative or the conclusion that this may actually have a significant impact in the sports setting and may have a significant impact with injury prevention and performance. What am I missing? Based on
Yeah, that's a good question.
This study, this is a big claim to come off of this study, and this is a point that we see all the time in papers where the data set is the data set, and the authors want to generate a narrative off of it. And nothing about this study looked at injury prevention, so you can't make that correlation. It's like the telephone game where you keep taking assumptions, and 2 or 3 assumptions in, you're way off. And this study didn't have an injured cohort, didn't look at athletes over a season. There isn't any validity established for it. So it's a fun story, but it's not supported by the evidence that's provided in the paper.
I think the problem that I have is that we know that what most people do already is that they read the title of the article, so in this case, the effects of tissue flossing on ankle range of motion and jump performance, and then they read the abstract only and they jump right to the conclusion. So that title, combined with the potential benefits of the results of this study may have significant impact, et cetera, and then there's your narrative. Boom. That's enough evidence to now start incorporating this. If I'm a coach, I'm going to be giving it to all my athletes. If I'm an athlete, I'm going to be doing it instead of actually training. And if I'm a PT, where I should be, or any healthcare provider, so that's the issue with it. There's nothing wrong with their data. Their data is the data. It's like what you said, Derek. It's not their fault that the effect size was small. I think that gives us information. If we're going to go further with this topic, we're going to ask different questions, or we're going to design the study differently. Or like what I said earlier, I'm going to use this data to say that I'm still not very convinced about this thing, and so it helps me maybe trim the fat a little bit. But to spin that narrative is the issue, because that's what most people are going to read. And if you already kind of have a bias towards this type of thing or some type of financial investment with it, I don't know, you get a kickback with Floss Band LLC every time. You're going to use the study to support your claim, and the evidence is just not that good. The data is just not great. So that's an issue. By the way, I want to make this point, and you two know this, but the audience probably doesn't. Anytime that we're talking about a study, this is not a shot. This is not a personal attack on the authors. We are discussing ideas. We're discussing the numbers. We're discussing the work. They happen to orchestrate the work, and so inherently they're a part of the discussion. But it's not a shot at any. This goes forward for any future podcast. And with this paper specifically, the authors were actually gracious enough to touch base with us and have a dialogue. Or Matthew Driller emailed us and just with some points to kind of discuss, because I had done a video talking about my thoughts with the article and some of the statistics, and we had a dialogue. We actually wanted to get both of them on the podcast to talk about these ideas, and we just couldn't work out the schedules. But I actually thought that was pretty cool to have the researchers want to touch base with the clinicians so we can kind of talk about these issues and make sense of things. But going back to some of this data, there's some things that could be noticed here. It looks as though, so first of all, we have a 90% confidence interval, and what that allows us to do is just kind of have a bigger window for the outcomes to be significant. So I don't want to say it makes it easier, but you're going to have statistical significance more often with a 90% confidence interval than say a 95% confidence interval. So in this study they chose 90% confidence interval. But I'm a little confused, and maybe you guys can make sense of this for me, whether we're looking at outcomes that are within group, so comparing pre to post of the floss specifically, or we're looking at differences between groups, between the floss post testing and the control post testing. And ultimately, are the effect sizes within group or between group? because I'm seeing on table 1, the effect sizes seem to be labeled as between group differences from floss to control, which I think, which we probably agree that would lend itself to more reliable data because we're looking at control versus the treatment. But if you're just, but it looks as though that the statistical significance in the floss data is actually within group.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you look in table 1, it's a pre to post is where it even reads like they're getting their statistical significance from. So they're not even looking if the control side versus the floss group. They're looking at the floss group beforehand versus the floss group afterwards. And even if you look at how they calculated the effect size, I ran the data through an effect size calculator on the internet. They're all over the place if you're ever looking to just quickly check your data. And when I looked at the control group versus the floss group, I was only getting an effect size of 0.169, which is lower than what they got. So I don't know if this has to do with just the way SPSS ran their data through, but also if I run the floss group post versus pre looking for an effect size, I get 0.287, which is pretty close to the 0.29 that they got. So I don't know if it's just my inability to crunch numbers or they looked at their statistical analysis a little bit different than the effect size calculators I'm using.
Derek, and just to point out, you ran that at a 95% confidence interval when you got the 0.16, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so just changing it from a 90% confidence interval to 95, we minimize that window, and suddenly what we deemed significant for the data of the study no longer breaches significance level.
And could it be possible that the effect size is simply mislabeled? As it stands now, it's labeled as between group effect size, but it's possible that it's actually just the within group?
Yeah, that would make sense. It's just a mislabel of table 1 on the far right-hand column.
Okay. Well, it doesn't, going back to what we talked about in the beginning of the show, already kind of questioning the clinical significance of the data, and now we're almost questioning the statistical significance of the data. Don't know. Do you guys have any other thoughts on table 1? Because, I mean, that's really all we have to go off of. There's no p-values to go further with this thing, so...
Yeah, it would have been good since they ran a t-test. We could have seen the p-values for each individual measurement, weight-bearing lunge test, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, so on and so forth. So we could assess significance that way. I mean, overall, I'm just very confused by table 1 at this point.
Oh, perfect. Okay, and I'm assuming that we've lost all 6 listeners, and if we're confused, they're confused, and they're like, no, we're done. But we're going to keep trucking along because we have to talk about mechanisms. So questioning the data aside, it's always important to then ask why something works. So I saw a change in range of motion. I saw a change in jump height. We can ask a couple questions there. What are the mechanisms? So how exactly, why is the data, is the range of motion changing? Physiologically, what's happening? Because that allows us to implement it. If I know how something works, I have a better idea of how to dose it, when to dose it, why to dose it, why would I pick this intervention over something else. Again, when we know something works, we can tease these things out. And it's also, does it matter? Are the tests themselves even testing what they're supposed to be testing? So I want to talk about the mechanisms first because I think that we can jump on this stuff pretty easily. For the range of motion changes in both the weight-bearing lunge test and the open chain dorsiflexion, the only proposed mechanism was that of a term called fascial shearing. Fascial shearing is not well defined in the study because it's not well defined anywhere in the literature that I've seen. And the only source in this study to support fascial shearing as a mechanism for increased range of motion is a book called Supple Leopard, so they actually cite that book in this study. Mike, stop laughing. They actually cite that book in this study. Derek, are you laughing too? I can't see. Oh, you're smiling. Yes, okay. Sorry, yes. Which in and of itself has 0 scientific references. So the source that they use to support their mechanism itself has zero science or evidence to support it. So I'm not aware of any evidence to support fascial shearing as a mechanism. I'm aware of a study by Chandri et al. In 2008 to show that it actually takes, it's probably beyond physiological realm to create that type of change in our tissues. The forces are upwards of like 2,000 plus pounds to like per square centimeter to create that type of change. So think about those crazy amount of forces somehow going like 2-3 layers deep and creating change, but not totally destroying everything in its path, your skin, for example. So it just doesn't seem very realistic. And it also seems like, well, I'll let you guys touch base. First of all, Mike, what do you think about fascial shearing?
I mean, there's not much to think about it. There's no evidence to support that thought process or narrative. There's nothing I've seen for it. So as far as I know, it's just a fancy fairy tale to tell someone a bedtime story with.
Derek, have you ever sheared your fascia?
No. This is one of those, once again, where you end up playing the telephone game. You have some studies looking at how fascia can tear at the molecular level, and it has nothing at all with any clinical application. But someone looks at this study and extrapolates it out and tries to say, well, this is the actual mechanism. And it doesn't even hold if you go 2 steps into logic, because there's no way dorsiflexion with a band on is even remotely close to the level of force if you go squat 450 pounds. So your orders of magnitude more force going through your ankle there. So if something as simple as putting a band on and plantar flexion and dorsiflexion could actually shear fascia, you should explode whenever you get a squat or actually go squat. So it doesn't make any plausible sense.
Yeah, they weren't even weight bearing. It was just knee extended, supported against gravity. Like Derek said, you would literally turn to dust if you got onto a barbell and actually squatted body weight. Like, it just wouldn't work. It doesn't make any sense logically.
You would disintegrate, right? Nobody would have an upper trap trigger point.
Yeah.
Those would not
I'm not
exist.
sure you could. I'm not sure you could stand up against gravity if your fascia sheared that easily. Like, we wouldn't even be alive right now.
Yeah. I'm actually looking at the Chandri article now and trying to see. But you guys, I'll just reference that for everyone. It's called 3-dimensional mathematical model for deformation of human fascia in manual therapy. Chaudhry and actually Robert Schlepp was the second author there.
Yeah.
Known as.
I think it was. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Mike.
I think it was 9,400 newtons of force, if I recall correctly.
Okay. And if I remember, that equated to like 2,000 plus pounds. But regardless, the results, 3-dimensional models equation revealed that very large forces outside the normal physiological range are required to produce even 1% compression and 1% shear in fascia lata and plantar fascia. Such large forces are not required to produce substantial compression and shear in superficial nasal fascia, however. So I think they did see that you could maybe cause like a 4% change if you went damn near to the end of physiological range on your nose.
Yes,
nose. Okay, maybe perhaps we can deform fascia, probably eyelids. I don't know, the skin on the back of my hand, so now we're reaching a little bit. Right?
I think the question is, would that improve your performance at anything?
Yeah. Bottom line is fascial shearing. I was surprised, mostly surprised that they used a source that didn't have any evidence behind it itself. But fascial shearing doesn't seem to be substantiated. So,
well, but there's a lot of things that end up. Going back to your trigger point reference, everything is based off of the Travel and Simon's book. So it's not off of evidence; it's off of a text. And we had the epistemology conversation last time, but a textbook is not science. The data is not there for it, or it's actually. Textbook is probably being generous on either one of those, unless they come hardbound being the only qualification for it.
Yeah, I think it's much more pop culture book. I wouldn't give that the title of textbook.
Okay, so then why are we seeing? Let's forget about what we talked about with the results and the data, whether or not it's actually statistically significant. How do we explain the range of motion changes if it's not physiological with fascial shearing? what's at play here?
I think you could make the argument similar to static stretching or even foam rolling. It just improves your tolerance to the range of motion. So the sensitization that you feel with that area, your somatic awareness, it just improves your tolerance to movement. Which could be the same argument for why jump velocity improved and jump height improved in both groups, is because it just improved their tolerance to the range of motion that they were testing.
What do you think, Derek? Why did range of motion improve if it's not fascial shearing?
I think a lot of it goes back to a combination of the clinical equipoise and just beliefs on it as well. So like we were saying, we can all get a couple extra degrees of range of motion if we believe something works. Just recently, Mark Bishop and Joel Bialowski just published a study titled The Influence of Clinical Equipoise and Patient Preferences on Outcomes of Conservative Manual Interventions for Spinal Pain. And basically, when they looked at variance, a lot of the variance in outcomes was based upon how much it was provider preference. So if the provider preferred using this method more, it actually explained 35.8% of the variance in post-intervention pain. Now, this is a pain study and, a little bit of a different conversation from range of motion, but it just goes to show the influence of provider belief in what's going on in the actual outcomes out of it.
Yeah.
Right, which heavily influenced the study because they weren't blinded.
So we're going back to just some type of perceptual stimulus. Or could we even say maybe diffuse noxious inhibitory control? The whole notion of creating a noxious sensory input to override another. Or like in this case, they're not in pain to start with, but you create this strong sensory environment and all of a sudden you can there's a short-term change in something.
It's just
fascial shearing. The problem is fascial shearing seems very permanent. If I shear my fascia, it's not like the T-1000 in Terminator 2 where it gets blown up into a million pieces and then it just molds back into its original form. If I'm shearing my fascia, it's going to stay sheared for a while. And so why would, first of all, that sounds terrible. It sounds like I'm injured now. But why would I have to then voodoo my ankle again? It should be a one-time deal. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Mike, what were you going to say?
I think I was just going to reference something like it's almost like a post hoc fallacy. Like, oh, we intervened with this floss in your leg, and therefore you should be able to jump higher or jump faster and have better range of motion. So go do that. Like we've caused you to have that improved ability because we intervened with something. So it just seems like an A plus B equals C to me. And
we've seen evidence showing comparing things like foam rolling, because I would put that in the same bucket here, comparing like an exercise bike warm up versus just a foam rolling warm up for the same amount of time, and then you get range of motion changes even more so with the exercise bike. It just it's just something, but it's not that mechanism. Fascial shear, I'm confident that we can say it's not that based on the current evidence.
Right.
Now, okay, so that's the range of motion, and then the mechanisms are kind of explained. Fascial shearing for range of motion, but fascial shearing doesn't have a bearing on the performance testing. For the performance testing, the mechanism of action that was proposed was similar to blood flow restriction, where you're getting changes in an endocrine response. I'm looking here. I don't know if they referenced anything else to explain the parallels with blood flow restriction other than changes in endocrine response. Was there anything else there?
Well, if you look at what they referenced, they talked about a study where it was 200 millimeters of mercury was what was needed to even cause that hormonal response, and they were averaging 182, so they were even below that threshold. But still, once again, it's speculation. Like this gets into, yes, it's a narrative they're driving, but there is no support for it. This study didn't look at hormonal response, so anything coming off of that is entirely speculation on what's causing it. It could just as easily be magical pixie dust. So, and there's just as much evidence to support it in this instance.
Yeah, there were no physiological markers, no blood draws, nothing was done in order to assess was there any endocrine responses that changed due to voodoo flossing.
The protocols are also completely different. Any
Yes.
VFR study or protocol that I've seen has the cuff at the proximal thigh for any lower extremity focus. It doesn't matter if it's the ankle, knee, or hip. It's proximal thigh. And the exercise protocols, the repetitions, the volume of work, it's totally different than what was done here. So
it's way more controlled. Way more controlled.
Yeah, there really is no comparison. Not yet. Yeah, you just can't take this data and with what happened and to say that. And again, why? So is the thought process then that they had some type of boost in endocrine response and they had this like potentiation effect because they were full of a bunch of ranging hormones, but both groups improved the same and pretty much the same with jump height, so that doesn't make any sense either. I'm just not saying I'm not seeing the parallel with blood flow.
I think they reference a heart rate variability study somewhere that kind of they're trying to support the argument that there's an acute increase in norepinephrine, which is affecting that ability as well for jump ability.
Well, both groups had that, I guess, right?
Right.
But we didn't measure that, so it doesn't matter.
It's pure conjecture. Pure conjecture.
I would think so. Maybe Voodoo band shit. If it was wrapped around my neck, I would probably have some adrenaline pumping.
I think you would probably have a hypoxic response there. I'll give you that.
Just enough.
I think they call that death.
No, just enough. You slap me in the face.
Oh.
All right.
At least it only took us a little while to get weird on this podcast. All of a sudden, the 6 people listening are like, "Oh shit, here they go."
No, they're back.
Quinn's personal life came out.
Okay. So that's the mechanisms, and we're kind of back to square one, which is, for me, it's disappointing. And before we get into just the validity of all this anyway, like why does this even matter in the first place? With Mike is just chomping. I'm trying to drag this podcast on for like 4 hours, and Mike is just forced to not talk about validity because it's common people. But if we don't know how something works, and I get that we have very little understanding about mechanisms for anything that we do, especially in the rehab world. We're not talking pharmaceuticals where there's much more control with the science. With what we do in clinic, the mechanisms are gray no matter what. I get it. But if you have no idea, if I have a table full of, I have just lined up a treatment table with Voodoo bands, with lacrosse balls, with the band distraction, like the joint distraction bands, foam rollers, instrument-assisted soft tissue set, a cupping set, whatever, name your poison there. Dry needles. If we don't understand the mechanisms, how do I differentiate picking one of those options over another? It comes down to which course you took first, which one did you learn first, or which one did you like first for whatever reason. That's probably going to be the one that you choose, and then it's going to be studies like this that have a conclusion that draws a narrative from questionable data.
Or sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, exactly right. So you spent all this money, you spent thousands of dollars to invested yourself into learning, to being trained in dry needling. You've invested so much time to learn that technique. Are you telling me you're not going to use that on the majority of your patients? Hell no. And then you're going to have to spin that narrative, right? And so that's my issue when we can't explain why something works or the mechanisms that are proposed have no backing themselves. Why would I choose this? Why would I choose this for a very small change? Derek, tell me why. Just tell me why. I'll do it. I'll do it. Just tell me why.
Well, my first thing would be don't do it. But the answer is because you believe it. And if you look at it, almost all of these, it all comes down to how much you believe it's going to work. So you're not changing any tissue structure. You're messing with belief systems out of this. And this gets into some of the conversation of the development of a ritual. So a lot of times this doesn't really do anything, but it just slowly starts becoming part of the ritual of training. Yes, I need to do mobility work for 45 minutes to get everything going. And you're not changing shit. You're just creating this big, elaborate theatrical performance where you could just have the weight on your bar or weight on the bar on your back and be getting going. So it's peacocking. for lack of a better way of saying it, to where it's like, the guy who goes into the gym and just gets to work and keeps his head down doesn't garner much attention. But we've all been in the gym. As soon as someone starts doing some new stupid shit, we all start paying attention to it. And it's all the new thing. And you're like, oh, look at the shiny object, or look at oh my, it has Voodoo on it. So did this originate in New Orleans? Can I get it on Bourbon Street? But it generates this conversation. So, I would much rather walk into the gym, blast some Taylor Swift, and get going, because that's what I need to warm up.
To play devil's advocate, Mike, this, I would say that if I'm comparing compression bands to something like foam rolling, I can at least wrap that band around the joint and then do a movement. With the foam roller, it's like an arduous thing. You got to roll on the ground. You're not doing anything but the rolling. If I'm going to maybe, right.
No one stopped to think, like, the act of rolling itself probably is having an effect. Not that the actual implementation of the foam roller, but that fact you're on the ground, moving your body around.
Right. Yeah, and the ritual, like what Derek said. But if the argument is, because we're going to get these questions from athletes and have kind of the discussion with other clinicians, is it seems like a very easy thing to implement and may create a small effect. So if it's easy and it can give me a little bit extra, what's the harm?
Yeah, I think the problem is we don't have any evidence to say that it does give you any extra being improved performance. And we have that shown in their own data that both groups improved jump height. I mean, if I would have looked at that data and they jumped, way higher than versus the control group, and we could talk about, well, it's way higher, but showed a significant difference, then I would be like, yeah, maybe we should be using this pre-training for basketball players or whatever. But it didn't show that. It's not showing improved performance significantly by itself, so why use it? I mean, we have other things that can be done, like Derek was talking about. Maybe for your warm-up, it's just doing the movements you're preparing to train under load, but you do them with less load or just body weight. Or as you mentioned earlier, there's a study by Morales that compared foam rolling to dynamic warm-up, and 10 minutes on a cycle erg demonstrated greater benefits and perception of achievable range of motion than versus foam rolling. So I think, why should we implement a device that could promote dependency long-term and becomes part of that ritual where people think they need to do it on a regular basis? Otherwise, they can't perform, when we have evidence to say that, well, it's not really improving your performance. It's an unnecessary dependency in my book. And at the end of the day, too, I'm just cheap. I'm a cheap bastard, and I don't want to spend money if I don't have to. So why am I going to spend money on these Voodoo floss bands that aren't actually having an effect?
Oh, Mr. Passive Aggressive. He did the air quotes for you guys who are going to be listening on iTunes or whatever. Can't see that. No,
you've made me hold that in for like 2 hours.
No, I'm going to let you go here in a second. I'm going to just let her rip. Derek, this study did not measure pain, and these were healthy controls, but I anticipate more studies on painful subjects and to see if an intervention such as this has an effect on pain. And let's say it does, because I made a Facebook post the other day where I said my knee was a little sore when I was squatting, and then I rubbed it really hard for 10 seconds, and I squatted again, and it felt better. And I see this as kind of like like an overload and sensory stimulus. So let's say like I'm squatting and I feel a little discomfort in the front of my ankle, and then I compress the bands around my ankle and I move through, and then when I squat after taking the bands off, I feel less pain, and it is a bridge to allow me to then load the movement that was once painful. It is a temporary bridge. What is your response to that, Derek?
I hate the bridge analogy, and I feel like you're just teeing me up for this. You have to ask where that bridge is leading. And, everyone's always like, bridge to somewhere, it's bridging the gap. Like, people forget, every time you drive over a bridge, a lot of science went into that. You're not going to go over a bridge that was built by Jim Bob down the street. There is entire engineering core that do nothing but build bridges. So for us to use that metaphor, there is an inherent implication that we actually have put some thought into what we're doing with this bridge. And very rarely in life is there ever an instance where the shortcut is the best way. And whenever you hear easy fix, that should already start throwing off a little bit of a flag to where you're like, all right, well, am I really getting a long-term effect out of this? And this goes back to how transient this effect may be. And if it's something that all of a sudden you start relying on, I would argue there is harm in that, because then you start losing faith in yourself to do the task and start thinking you need to go put Voodoo floss on it or whatever you're building your shitty bridge with. And if we are there to really facilitate independence in our patients or our athletes, doing interventions like this may be a quick fix, but it certainly is not in the best interest of the long-term outcomes.
Yeah. I go back to, for me, it comes down to being able to differentiate between interventions. Why am I choosing this over this? And when I have no answer, and if I say anything other than I don't know to the athlete who asks me if I should do, what does this do? Why would I pick compression band over foam rolling over this and that? If I say anything other than I don't know, I'm creating a false narrative. I'm because there's no evidence to say either way. So yeah, I'm with you now. It could be singing a different tune if the data was different. Like if the effect sizes were larger, like if it was just better data, maybe we're like, well, I'd like to see some more research. Okay. We still can't explain why, but at least there seems to be something there. Now let's dive in a little bit, but it doesn't seem to be even that. And this kind of gets into, are we truly measuring even what we're supposed to be measuring? So I'll go back to hold it, Mike. I know you're rearing to go here. I'll go back to the conclusion. The potential benefits regarding the results of this study may have a significant impact in the sports setting. Sports setting could mean anything. So that's just kind of a general statement. More specifically, though, our results would suggest that including band flossing on the ankle joint before taking part in any sports that require jumping actions may not only improve performance, boom, that's a claim, we need evidence, may not only improve performance, but may also provide a novel strategy for injury prevention, another claim, through increasing ankle range of motion. Well, that last part, we don't know if it actually does that yet, but let's talk about those claims that this intervention and just increasing range of motion in the ankle improves performance and also decreases risk of energy. Mike, go.
Yeah, so it's a lot to unpack here. We'll start with the range of motion. So obviously this intervention was done on healthy subjects who most likely have normative, what we would call normative ankle dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, eversion. So, okay, you maybe, I'm not even sure based on what we've discussed with Table 1's issues today, maybe you improved it by 6 degrees of dorsiflexion in a controlled setting with an extended knee. Like, what does that mean to sports performance? Does that static measurement transfer over into dynamic movement? And if it does, how does that improve performance? Because it's really almost a reductionist approach. It's like, let's look at a single joint in a multi-jointed movement where a lot of things are happening and not taking into account kind of a global perspective. I don't think you can just look at ankle dorsiflexion, plantar flexion and say that small improvement actually turned into anything that mattered. And their own data shows that. Again, both groups improved in jump height and jump velocity, so it didn't make a difference either way for the ranges of motion. And we don't have any. Now, if this would have been done on, say, someone had acute trauma to the area, and we were looking at improving meaningful difference, and we have to define what is meaningful difference in the ankle joint for rehab purposes, maybe this would be a different approach. But this was in healthy subjects that already have normative ankle range of motion, so it just doesn't equate a whole lot to me.
Well, we don't even know if they did, because that wasn't even. There's no injury history on these. There's no. They didn't take. There's no mention of normative values even.
Right.
So
that's
to say, yeah. We're
hypothesizing that because they say they're healthy subjects, they had normative range of motion.
I'd like to go through some of the sources that they reference regarding injury risk, regarding ankle range of motion as it relates to injury risk. They cite a few. There's a Malaris Cook and Kent study from 2006. Jill Cook,
Yeah.
And the name of the study was Reduced Ankle Range of Motion Associated with Patellar Tendinopathy. So now we're in to painful population, injury state, so not the same population here. And they found that reduced ankle dorsiflexion, reduced, we don't know what that means just yet, but reduced ankle dorsiflexion range may increase the risk of patella tendon injury among volleyball players. They did use the weight-bearing lunge test, so at least we're seeing that test kind of being reused. What they saw, when they talk about that quote, may increase the risk, really what they found was, of all of the outcome measures that they looked at, ankle dorsiflexion was the only one that had an association with the volleyball players who had patellar tendinopathy. We cannot...
On the right side.
Yeah.
Just on the right side.
Just on the right side.
The left side didn't even wash out.
So obviously we can't infer causation there, meaning we can't say reduced dorsiflexion causes patellar tendinopathy, nor can we say that increasing dorsiflexion range of motion would somehow have a positive effect. They did seem to have a cutoff, players with less. So they measure their weight-bearing lunge test differently also. They use an inclinometer. This is actually how I've seen it done more often, as an inclinometer on the anterior shin, and they measure in degrees and not centimeters, because the shank, like your shin length, can kind of affect how far away your foot is from the wall. So I think the inclinometer is maybe more reliable, but they had a cutoff of players with less than 45 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion may appear to, that was the association, appeared to have a greater risk of patellar tendinopathy, but that wasn't a strong cutoff. It wasn't clear cut. So that was one article that our article in question used to support the premise that increasing ankle range of motion reduces or is an injury risk factor. And then they cited another one, GABE or GAB, G-A-B-B-E, from 2004. The name of the study was Predictors of Lower Extremity Injuries at the Community Level of Australian Football. This was a prospective study, and they, again, used the weight-bearing lunge test, so at least we're seeing that test. And for the 59 players that they looked at, a lower extremity injury, or for the 59 players who ended up getting injured, a lower extremity injury was the first injury sustained during the season. I might actually have that mixed up. It might have been 59 total. But only dorsiflexion range of motion was significantly associated with sustaining a lower extremity injury. Now, lower extremity injury can mean a lot of things, and we can say the same about causation, cannot be inferred. I wasn't able to find a cutoff. So to say that dorsiflexion range of motion was associated with a lower extremity injury risk, that's about as far as we got. We don't know much beyond that, but this is an article that this paper cited, and then they cited one more from 2000 to Breezy. Limited dorsiflexion predisposes. Actually, they didn't cite this. I think I pulled this one up. Limited dorsiflexion predisposes to injury of the ankle in children. This was weird. They looked at the uninjured side of 82 kids who had already sprained their ankle. So they took like an acute ankle sprain or foot injury, and then they just measured their ankle range of motion on their non-affected side, and showed that kids who had the injury had decreased dorsiflexion on their unaffected side compared to a control group who didn't currently have an ankle or foot injury. And the mean in the control group for dorsiflexion was 12.8 degrees. They used a GONI there, so 13 degrees. And Mike, you'll love this. With the knee extended, it was with the knee extended, it was 11.2 degrees in the kids. So let me back up here. Knee bent for the kids who already had an ankle injury, with their knee bent, they averaged 5.7 degrees of dorsiflexion. With their knee straight, they averaged 11. So it makes sense. Like, you straighten your knee, you put the gastroc on tension, blah, blah, blah. For the control group, it was 12.8 degrees with knee flexed, and it was 12.8 degrees with knee extended and 21 degrees with knee flexed. So there was a difference, but we go back to inferring causation. We don't know. But there seems to be, well, I guess the point I'm trying to make is the authors of this study, they're not just saying, ankle range of motion is a risk factor, and they're just taking that statement and it's out of the blue. There does seem to be something there. Now, we could break down these articles specifically and find that there's so many holes that you just have to throw it out completely. Like, that's very possible.
Yeah.
What I mean?
They're making a huge illogical jump. Like, they're taking healthy subjects and examining dorsiflexion and saying, well, we improved range of motion, therefore, because we improved it, that's going to mitigate injury occurrences. And we know that the risk for injury, first off, and you guys know this about me, I don't even like the word prevention because we're not going to prevent anything. There's just far too many factors that we have to account for. And yes, we could argue, absolutely, there seems to be enough evidence to say ankle range of motion, especially dorsiflexion during drop landing and jumps, does matter and can possibly be a correlate to injury risk for lower extremity. But outside of that, we really don't know anything based on the current evidence outside of that. And so to say, because you improved it in healthy subjects, you're mitigating injury occurrences, that's a huge illogical jump in my book.
I agree. Big time jump. One more that Driller and Overmare cited, because I think it's important to point this out, because in our study in question, they reference the ACL, and they say they make a point or make a statement that seems to state that ankle range of motion restriction has a correlation to ACL injury rates. This is in the introduction of our compression band study. Mm-hmm. So I'm not just kind of making this up here. It says, when landing from a jump, the forefoot usually contacts the ground and then the ankle moves into dorsiflexion. Indeed, it has been suggested that reduced ankle dorsiflexion range may be a risk factor for the development of patellar tendinopathy, we've already covered that one, and is also a risk factor for ACL injury. So claim alert, right? So we got to figure out, so then let's look at the sources that they use for that. The only one that I could find was that they used that would have made sense for that claim is from Fong et al. In 2011. This is a reference in the compression band study. Ankle dorsiflexion range of motion and landing biomechanics. They measured dorsiflexion with a goniometer. They saw that greater ankle dorsiflexion with the knee extended was associated with greater knee flexion and smaller ground reaction forces when you land. That makes sense, right? So basically they said that like when your ankle dorsiflex, it's associated with more knee flexion when you land, like your joints are absorbing the impact, and then that seems to correlate with decreased ground contact. That makes sense. And when we think about some of the ACL injury risk mechanisms, landing on a bent knee or landing on a locked knee, like large ground contact forces, okay, cool. But this study, that's as far as they went. The Fong et al. Study, that's all they showed. They weren't trying to, this wasn't a prospective study, and there were no other measures to say that this also then equates to increased or decreased injury rate. So to go back to the compression band study, to say that increased dorsiflexion is a risk, or decreased dorsiflexion is a risk factor for ACL injuries based on the simple fact that people just bend their knee a little bit more when they use their ankle dorsiflexion. That's what you said, Michael. It's a leap. And it also assumes that any change in the weight-bearing lunge test is going to then be shown in a landing task.
Yeah.
Like if I gain 1.6 centimeters in half-kneeling ankle dorsiflexion, somehow then I'm going to automatically be able to use that 1.6 centimeters when I land.
Yeah, it's increasing control in a controlled environment range of motion versus a dynamic environment. And just because that range of motion is increased in that static measurement doesn't mean that it's going to transfer over to your ability to access it when it counts. More specifically, when it counts and you're fatigued.
Right. And then back to the Fong et al. 2011, they had a cutoff. The average amount of dorsiflexion was about 14 degrees. So we're kind of seeing a trend there with like straight knee, extended knee dorsiflexion, like an average being in that 10 to 14 degree range. But that wasn't necessarily an injury risk factor cutoff. It was just kind of like a normative value. And then that study, reduced. They claim reduced ankle dorsiflexion as a risk factor for ACL injury based on that. So they make that leap too. So I don't know, man.
Well, but this gets into, we all like to distill things into simple concepts, and I'm certainly guilty of it. I'm sure the two of you are as well. But it's way more complicated than that. Like, if you look at some of the reviews on what correlates with ACL injury, you're talking 30 plus factors going into it. So yes, you could make the argument that distilling it down and controlling for one may have something, but it may have an effect, but is it even remotely significant out of it? So there are just so many variables, and our time could likely be spent or utilized much better elsewhere than trying to make a jump to say because we increased dorsiflexion, we have decreased the likelihood of an ACL injury. So, I mean, if you want to decrease the likelihood of ACL injury, don't play sports. I just dramatically decrease the likelihood of an ACL injury happening.
Well, you've got to establish efficacy and then effectiveness, right? So, like with efficacy, we have to establish normative values and range of motion. Then we have to establish some type of risk factor cutoff prospectively, and then it's got to be, do our interventions have an effect on that range of motion, and then does that change in range of motion then have an effect on injury rates? Like there's a step process here, and go back to the leaps. This is why it's like a leap in logic. That's exactly what's happening, is we're jumping over those steps to get to the end, and we just haven't made that yet.
A great article on that is the Barrel study that was released, I think, what was it, last year? And he goes through in comparison of like, this is what needs to happen step by step from conjecture all the way through, like you said, Quinn, establishing normative values, cutoff points, risk factors, so on and so forth, and synthesizing that information out. And my concern with this approach, kind of like the overarching theme here, is, okay, so is the argument we should be going around and doing a WBLT to every single athlete or patient we come into contact to? And, you're a degree off of dorsiflexion or anterior tibial, centimeter off for anterior tibial translation. So you're at greater risk. So now we need to intervene. Like there's so much potential for a slippery slope here with this narrative that it almost looks to me like parallels to the FMS. And we all know where the research has gone with the FMS most recently is that it doesn't have a predictive value for injury occurrences. And just because you look at 7 arbitrary movements doesn't equate to anything ultimately, other than can you perform those movements? And it doesn't transfer over into sport. That's kind of the same thing I see here. Like to me, it is unlikely the measurements we're taking that although are reliable, I don't think they're valid measurements. It's not ultimately getting at what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, there's also this baseline assumption that more is better. Right. And, what happens if we maximize everyone to the most dorsiflexion you could possibly get? So just because you have more dorsiflexion, does that necessarily correlate with a decreased injury risk? It's because we all want to look, and this gets back into the narrative of it. Well, do we need to increase inflammation or decrease inflammation? Do we need to increase range of motion or decrease range of motion? Well, more likely
blood flow.
Yeah. Yes, blood flow, pain pressure threshold. Like you can use any one of these, and it all goes back to the narrative that isn't substantiated. It's if you're going to say that you need to increase dorsiflexion, it has an injury prevention component to it, then there has to be a window on that. Like, in just the automatic assumption that more is better is wrong. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people walking around with a ton of dorsiflexion that have piss poor biomechanics, and it's multifactorial. And you just using the more dorsiflexion is better. I can certainly tell you plenty of athletes I've had that have all kinds of dorsiflexion, and when they land, it's like dropping a cinder block off of a house. So it doesn't, like, just distilling it down to this one component, you miss the actual probability of having some kind of influence.
And I think this goes back to what Derek was saying earlier. Like, our time could be better spent trying to control variables that we have evidence showing that actually matter when it mitigates injury risk. Jones et al. Did a study on this. I think it was a systematic review, and he looked at basically training load has a huge effect on mitigating injury risk, illness, fatigue state, and then psychosocial management or coping skills. Like those are things that we can be talking to our athletes about on a regular basis, especially with Gabbitt's work coming out regularly about acute on chronic workload ratios. Like we have a lot of evidence to support other variables we should be focusing our time on with athletes in order to mitigate risk for injury, not what is your ankle dorsiflexion.
Okay, yeah.
Well, there was a review by Terada in 2013 in Journal of Athletic Training for therapeutic interventions for increasing ankle dorsiflexion after ankle sprain. Now, granted, this is an injured population, but it's a systematic review. And if you look at their plots, it is literally throwing the kitchen sink at this on what they have studies for, like mobilization with movement, RICE, and they all have, what's funny, the same type effect of what we see in this study, where everything has a little bit of a positive effect, but the confidence interval always crosses 0. So it just shows that you can kitchen sink this, or you can realize that a lot of this gets better on its own.
Yeah, I'll close the door on the ankle range of motion and injury risk factor here with one review that I dug up, that in 2015, Mason, McKay et al., the title, The Effect of Reduced Ankle Dorsiflexion on Lower Extremity Mechanics During Landing, a Systematic Review. And they kind of said, they basically summarized what we said. There is evidence, probably much of what we've talked about, that restricted dorsiflexion range of motion may alter lower extremity landing mechanics in a manner which predisposes athletes to injury. Interpretation of these results was made difficult by the variation in landing tasks investigated and the lack of studies investigated sport-specific landing tasks and different mechanical patterns. So it's basically what you guys just said. There's so many variables to take into account, and this one variable, then to extrapolate that to a narrative that we're reducing injury risk by making a 1.6 centimeter change at best, it's tough. It's tough to do. So
I mean, I wish it was this simple. I really do. Like, if it were this simple, you better believe I would check WBLT on every single person I came into contact with, especially if they play a jump-based sport. But it's not this easy. It's not that simple. Like anything, you examine it more closely and you realize, wow, this is a pretty complex topic.
So let's shift away from injury risk and just talk, performance. Because Derek, you said something like, more is not better. But from an injury risk factor, from a pain perspective, but maybe, let's spin the narrative to performance. Like for a squat, for example, a front squat, overhead squat is more better in that case because, the more anterior tibial translation, the more your hips can kind of shift forward under the bar, more upright position, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got, and then this is another little qualm that I have with our original paper is that they seem to say that the fascial shearing or like ankle range of motion was kind of its own thing, and then performance and BFR was its own thing. But then in the conclusion, it lumps ankle range of motion and performance together. So it's kind of confused on the narrative in general. But these are papers cited in this one paper actually cited in the compression band paper to show ankle range of motion as it relates to performance. It was one study in 2010 from Conradson et al., and it was the title Ankle Joint Mobility and Standing Squat Posture in Elite Junior Cross-Country Skiers. It was a pilot study, and they measured passive dorsiflexion, I think with a GONI, and showed that reduced ankle dorsiflexion was associated with increased trunk flexion during a squat. So I'm kind of picturing that as somebody who's like trying to squat with a vertical shin, and instead of like falling on their ass, they counterbalance themselves by hinging forward. So it makes sense. But that's all.
Yeah, but this kind of gets back to that Fry study from a few years ago where they let some people's knees go forward in a squat and then they didn't control for it, and you either had to get torque at your knee or your hip.
Yeah.
So are you robbing Peter to pay Paul if you're trying to increase this ankle dorsiflexion out of it? And once again, we are immediately back to the multifactorial nature of all of this.
Does it maybe depend on the task? Go ahead.
Good. It depends.
Yeah.
Once again, it's multifactorial.
So maybe I don't know anything about cross-country skiing. So maybe if I talked to a cross-country ski coach and they said, if somebody can squat more, like just kind of sit straight down into a quarter squat or be more upright, which I don't know. But, trunk flexion is like inefficient or something like that. And that's a universal thing that's known in cross-country skiing. And then you show this, maybe with my cross-country skiers and I'm going to get in next week, maybe we're doing more like front squats and like counterbalance squats where we're cueing to be really upright and to like use our ankle dorsiflexion a little bit more, and we're not going to low bar squat these kids because they already good morning their squat anyway. I'm pontificating, but I think it goes to the point of, again, maybe it's task specific, because the compression band article doesn't really cite much more than that other than previous studies that we've already talked about as far as dorsiflexion as it relates to movement and performance, but which I was surprised about because there's actually a lot of them. Dill et al., 2014, altered knee and ankle kinematics during squatting in those with limited weight-bearing lunge dorsiflexion range of motion. So they used the weight-bearing lunge test, and they showed that greater ankle dorsiflexion with the weight-bearing lunge was associated with more knee flexion and greater ankle dorsiflexion displacement. Duh. Right? So basically they were able to bend their knees more if they had more ankle dorsiflexion based on the weight-bearing lunge test. So again, it's just this association between positioning, like a joint action, and then just overall positioning in a movement pattern. But is it going to go beyond me just cueing somebody to push their knees forward in a squat? Like, is it going to equate to me having like a whole package of ankle intervention? Or am I just going to be like, yeah, use your quads, like use your ankles, or let your knees come forward? Go ahead.
Based on this study's data, they didn't improve jump height. That's performance in this realm, right? That's what we're discussing.
Yeah.
So based on this study, no, there would be no reason to implement it.
And I think because the study that in question, the original study that we've been talking about, the premise is so weak. I think I'm kind of setting us up for maybe future talks, like how joint actions can influence movements. Like again, I've got 3 or 4 listed here, but essentially it comes down to the fact that in a squat in particular, if you alter tibial translation, it changes mechanics upstream. That's all. They restricted squats. They've actually done it several where they restrict something like a back squat. They restrict tibial translation, decreases depth. It decreases joint moments, like at the quads. They measure like decreased activity of the quads. If you can't translate the tibia forward, it's more into like the back and the hips. It increased trunk flexion angle. So it's pretty consistent. But it's not good or bad. It just is. It's just, at that point, it's just biomechanics.
You can measure all kinds of things.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you measured anything meaningful or valid that has an actual, this affects injury risk or performance.
Well, so we're past injury risk. It ain't pain either.
Yeah.
But for performance, I would say that perhaps I'm going off of jump, away from that, because it's just, there's nothing there. But like squatting, for a front squat or an overhead squat, generally, if we're in a vacuum, if we're taking the same athlete, and we have the athlete do a good morning and try to hold a barbell over their head, it's very difficult. But if they have a more vertical torso, which many times translates to their hips driving forward under the bar and their ankles and their knees traveling forward, utilizing ankle dorsiflexion, generally translates to a position that's more sustainable in a movement like a front squat or an overhead squat. So in that case, the narrative is simply dorsiflexion allowed us to, or is it part of a position?
I think it's just a part of the entire kinematic line,
Yes. That's all. Dorsiflexion is a thing. It's not a thing. And we talk about, because it's a thing. It's an actual thing. The ankle does this.
Yeah, apparently.
We talk about validity, too, because it's not just is it valid or is it invalid, because there's subsets of validity. Does the weight-bearing lunge test, is it invalid because it doesn't measure dorsiflexion? Or is it invalid because that dorsiflexion is not relevant? Because that's not the same question.
I think it's the latter.
Okay.
just saw a study today. I was looking. I wish I would have saved it, but it actually did demonstrate it. Like you are, when we talk about validity, I think the WVLT is measuring ankle dorsiflexion. I think that's a valid test for that.
So that
it's
construct,
more of a question
that
of
construct is valid. Just that.
Right.
Okay.
But what does that mean? That's where the secondary issue of validity comes. And how do we extrapolate out that test results to actually anything meaningful? And is it valid for anything meaningful? Why am I checking this on my athletes and patients? What is it ultimately going to get at? Why does it matter?
Or even more so, how are you going to intervene on it? So, it's one thing to have something that's super reliable if you're checking for ankle dorsiflexion, but it ultimately comes down to, do we need to change it, and does that change correlate with whatever outcome measure, whether it be athletic performance or risk reduction? And once again, you're already like 3 steps away from where you started without confirming the first step.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is all transient effects. If I went back after the single session of Voodoo flossing a week later, is it still there? I highly doubt it. My money would say no. So what's the long-term effect of changing ankle dorsiflexion, and can we change it from a long-term perspective?
Future research is needed, Mike.
Always.
What else? What else you guys got? I think I'm done.
I think the horse itself is disintegrated. We've kicked the shit out of this horse. Like, there's nothing left.
Yeah, we've definitely ridden this one in. So how many listeners do you think we've lost by this point?
Everyone.
How many?
It's
Well,
all
we started
over.
with 6. We started with 5 because one of them couldn't make it.
Yeah.
iTunes is currently pulling the podcast.
I actually
They're like,
think,
no.
I just checked iTunes. We're not on there anymore. And this is not even live yet. We're still just recording this. This is how bad it is. It just seeped. The shit has just seeped into the air, into the fucking space. All right. I'll reiterate the fact that if you want more of this awesome info, should I even plug the events?
Oh, yeah.
Be anything like this? Okay.
For more of just us ranting.
Come to Boston, yeah, to hear Derek and Mike talk about this more for an entire day, and add some clinical pearls in there too. Why does it matter? Well, that's what they're going to tell you in Boston this Saturday on July 8th, and also in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and Hillsboro, Oregon, and Ottawa, Canada, Falls Church, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, Harwood Heights, Illinois, and Seattle, Washington. So check those dates all through the rest of 2017, clinicalathlete.com. Is that it?
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah.
All right.
Appreciate you tuning in.
We're done.
All
Thanks.
6 of you.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.